The campground. A family gathered over a bed. A distressed daughter clutched at wrinkled bed sheets. Somewhere inside the tight space, someone sniffed and chairs groaned under dead weight. The TV and CD player were left off. Most assuredly, music would be playing if somebody had thought to bring something. So the family sat in silence. 2 daughters, 2 husbands, a couple friends, and 1 grandson. The grandson was tucked in the back corner of the hospital room, lying awkwardly on his back, his jacket rolled up like a pillow under his head. He was tired of watching the emaciated chest rise and fall, rise and fall. He was too busy studying the ceiling, counting the tiles. After all, he could hear the ragged breathing. As long as there was breathing, there was sure to be movement on the bed. The boy had first stared at his grandmother for a long 15 minutes from one of the uncomfortable reclining chairs. He was so horrified by what he was seeing, he couldn't even look away. When he was finally able to turn his head, it was once he realized the woman lying in the hospital bed was his own grandmother. This was the woman he saw every Christmas, the woman who spoiled him rotten every chance she got. And now he loomed over her as a sad visitor, watching her at her worst. She couldn't get any older, and she certainly couldn't get any sicker. There was nowhere else she could go. She would never be able to leave the bed and go home like the family would have wanted. That thought provoked the first series of tears from the grandson. He departed from the bedside and took a seat, hiding his face in his hands. He was aware that his mother and father were staring at him, so he buried his face even deeper. The world went black, but remnants of his surroundings held fast to the outskirts of his vision. All that was left was the sharp hiss of oxygen through plastic tubing and his grandmother's resonant snore. When his fingers unhinged, the dim light crept in. He knew he couldn't stay in that chair. He had too clear a view of the bed. The grandson bounded to his feet and slid down to the far wall to collect inside a fetal ball. From that position, all he could make out were limbs, exaggerated in size and length, winding over the bedspread and gently smoothing the fabric flat. In the hours that crept by, his family members perused in and out of the hospital room to catch some precious hallway air or some water from the neighboring drinking fountain. Yet he never left the room. He didn't watch his grandmother, but he stayed on the floor, listening to her sonorous breathing. And when a breath came a little late in the series, his own breath would stall in his throat. 1,000 thoughts would race through his mind, stumbling and finally trampling into one another to mold into one concise motion. Time would stand still for the broken island atop the bed. Then the breath would finally come, and the grandson would fall back into his makeshift bed, somewhat disappointed. His mother told him he should go home with his father. He had school in the morning, and he had made his appearance for the day. The grandson shook his head and settled back into the coat, staring at the ceiling. He began to count. 1 towel for every choked breath, 1 towel for every second her breathing stalled. Then the nurse reappeared, and the group huddled into the corner. Someone started to cry, and someone left the room. The grandson remained where he was, listening to his grandmother's noise. He knew what was happening, but he didn't allow himself to leave the room. He forced himself to stay. Something marvelous was about to take place. He was about to experience one of life's few promises so early in the game. All he had to do was watch. All he could do was watch. The grandson didn't know why he was suddenly so excited. He couldn't explain it in words. A part of him knew that he was one step closer to understanding the mystery of life and death. Only by witnessing the act could he truly gain his bragging right. So when the nurse upped the dose of morphine into his grandmother's bloodstream, he was there at her bedside. Years later, if told to recount the scene, he would state that her last breath was a gargle, as if she had a mouthful of water. He would state that her body sank so low that she almost sank as flat as the mattress, a collapsible piece of furniture inside a soiled gown. The grandson would admit that he had stared down into his grandmother's gaping mouth, past her unhinged jaw, into the dark well of his darkest dreams, to catch a fleeting glimpse of what could be lingering there. But he knew that whatever he was looking for was already gone. He almost wanted to climb into that well and plummet freely into the darkness with nothing to assist him but his own blind faith and utmost understanding. He understood that death was all the same, no matter how it transpired. First there was agony, and then there was peace. There was a loss of sight, hearing, speech, and mind. In another word, peace. How could there be a hell in all that rest? At the bedside he closed his eyes, inhaled through his nose, and held it. Soon the bitter cries from his family members were reduced to slow static, and his body exploded into dust. Brilliant lights lit up the darkness, and he thought that he could almost feel the heat on his face. A charge of pain rippled through his temple, and he came to on the hospital floor, with his family urgently milling around him. But he wasn't hurt. He was renewed somehow. He had tasted the unknown impossible, and it was so good. He wanted an encore. He wished that he were dead. Paul realized that he was driving up to the woods more and more often. He would routinely park his station wagon in one of the isolated parks and trudge up his favorite hiking trail. He knew the area well. There was a detour he could take apart from the path, leading deeper into uncharted territory, where the trees were so close their branches weaved together. Near a massive crumbling boulder, he left the path and disappeared amongst the heavy wood with only a duffel bag over one shoulder. He was never afraid of losing his direction. He had been off the trail too many times. Some 100 yards from the crumbling boulder, he had set up wooden stakes in the earth, each one a close distance from the last. This way he could safely follow the line of stakes another half hour or so into a clearing he liked to call his campground. No other person had ever wandered into his section of the woods, he was certain of that. It was too far from any of the main trails or streams. There the wildlife was rampant. There the air was thick and the brush was even thicker. On the mountain he felt absolutely distant from the outside world, as though stranded on an island somewhere in the Pacific. He ventured into his campground twice a week, once on Wednesdays and once on Sundays, and he stayed for long periods of time. He didn't want to push his luck by visiting more than twice a week. There were the authorities to think of, and the park rangers that he had seen countless times around the area. One Wednesday afternoon, only days after Paul's 25th birthday, he arrived at the clearing with his safety goggles already strapped across his face. With a hungry smile, he set his back down on a nearby tree stump and set about rifling through its contents. From the bag he extracted a rusty axe, which he tossed from one hand to the other, before setting it neatly aside. Somewhere a hawk screamed and took flight over his head. He looked once into the harsh sunlight and flared his nostrils. The sun was much more apparent here, because of the sheer lack of tree cover. It was only a matter of time before a ranger noticed the awkward bald spot on the mountain face and went probing the area. Paul knew that he would have to find a new spot sometime soon. Until then he was going to have a little more fun. Paul grabbed his chainsaw and yanked the pull cord. The calm forest instantly exploded with the saw's grinding snarl, its body spitting black smoke into the air. Paul approached a tree to his left and cut into it, the bark flaking away like dead skin. Once the saw tasted the oak's tough center, it began to groan and tremble in Paul's hands, the smoke clouding his senses. That was always his cue to arc his back and lean all his weight forward. He could feel the entire tree crack and bend. Leaves and pieces of branches rained down on him as confetti amidst a dramatic celebration. He could hear the tree screaming, in his mind and in his ears. In reality, there was only the sound of snapping wood as it gave way to the saw's teeth, but inside his mind, the tree's voice took on a more humanistic nature. The voices died just as the tree's last leg of support buckled. Dust sprayed Paul in the face, and the chainsaw was suddenly eating away at air. Paul almost lost his balance, but caught himself before he could fall forward into the terrifying blade. He was able to kill the saw and catch a breath as the tree toppled to the earth. It struck another neighboring oak, and both seemed to cling to each other with gaunt arms, before the broken giant finally rolled away and smacked the mountain with a tremendous crash. Every tree top swayed as an ominous cloud of airborne dirt overwhelmed the sky. Then everything went still again. Paul sighed and watched a flock of birds make their escape. He sat on the new stump, cleaning the sweat from his face with a handkerchief. After riding the goggles over his eyes and dusting the splinters from his coveralls, he was ready to begin again. He decided to retire the chainsaw for the day, so he returned it to the bag. He would only take one more. His eye caught another tree on the opposite end of the campground. There were already a circle of stumps surrounding this tree, marking the previous homes of its neighbors. He approached the tree with the axe in his hand. At first he caressed the oak's scaly bark and rapped on it with his knuckles, as if to say, "Anybody home?" When nothing appeared to answer, he smiled and stepped back. With a horrible cry, he wound his arm back and threw the axe's blade into the tree. There was a sensation like colliding with a brick wall, and Paul's arm snapped back to his chest like retractable pieces of measuring tape. The axe went pinwheeling into the tall brush, the head and handle completely separate from one another. Paul hit the weeds, clutching his chest and blinking tears of pain from his eyes, which collected in the lips of his goggles. He looked up at the tree with a new sense of unsteadiness. He felt utterly useless beneath this frightening colossus in the sky. What truly startled him, besides the pain in his arms, was the fact that the tree didn't have a scratch on it. He got back on his feet and measured himself before the mighty oak. He touched the place where the axe had struck. There was a slight notch in its side, as though only a bird had pecked it with its beak. Still cradling his arms to his chest, he sought out his axe from the foliage. He found the steel head and then the handle. He marveled at where the piece of wood had split and broke and where the axe head had actually chipped. The blade was even warped. He looked at the bent piece of steel and then back to the tree, his thoughts sputtering. He threw aside his damaged materials and grabbed the chainsaw. He eyed the tree carefully, pulling the cord. He advanced on the tree and slashed at its belly. There was an obnoxious whine, and the saw's body was forced into his breast. His breath escaped him, and he fumbled to shut it off. When he looked back at the tree, there was only the smallest difference. He pulled the cord again and eased the saw against the tree. The belt around the blade radically slowed, and Paul had a hard time controlling the body. Spurts of dust came away from the bark, but besides that, the teeth weren't making any progress whatsoever. The engine shrieked, and then the belt snapped. The power tool immediately died, and Paul let it fall from his hands. It collided with the earth as a dormant, armored carcass. He inspected the cut in the bark. There was barely enough room for him to insert his thumbnail. Something wasn't right. He couldn't understand why he had failed. All around him was evidence that he had been victorious time and time again. There were too many fallen trees and dry stumps to argue otherwise, so why? Why was this tree, a tree not unlike any of the others, still standing? Defeated and miserable, Paul gathered his broken weapons and stowed them away inside the bag. He decided that he would be back. It wasn't smart to return to the clearing after all he'd done, but he couldn't live with the defeat. He just couldn't accept it. Yes, he would be back, at least one more time, to take care of the unfinished business. Then he would move on to another campground. He gave the tree one last distressed look before exiting the clearing. He found the first marker and began a slow trek back to the main trail. All the while he wore his safety goggles, and by the time he realized he was still wearing them, he was just pulling up into his apartment complex. He figured he could wear them a little while longer. That night he slept with them on. In the parking lot, Grace spotted John's car and hesitated. "Let's just go into the park," she offered. "Come on, I owe you a beer anyway, right?" She smiled and took his arm. "Right." Paul made a mental notation of John's car and tried to memorize his license plate. He didn't know what he was going to do with this information, but it felt like he was getting to know John Krasner bit by bit. The bar was incredibly busy, and there was really nowhere to sit. They stood at the end of the bar and attempted to get the tender's attention. Paul realized that the man serving drinks was the same that had thrown him out the night before. If he could help it, he wanted to steer clear of another altercation. He told Grace to order him a beer, and he crossed the floor. In the guise of walking to the restroom, he was actually looking for John. He smiled when he spotted Krasner near a group of girls. He was staring right at Paul, his eyebrows crossing. "How's it hanging, John?" Paul asked. John instinctively backed up a step or two. "How's your nose?" "Fine, thanks." John looked over at Grace and smirked. "So, you're with her?" "That's right. I didn't think you would mind. You have enough to keep you entertained, am I right?" Paul motioned to the girls at the bar. "I do all right," John said with his eyes closed. He sipped from his glass of beer and turned away from Paul to whisper in a woman's ear. The girl looked up at Paul and stifled laughter. "Good luck," John added. "What?" Paul was noticeably shaking. "Nothing. All I'm saying is that girl is never satisfied. She can't be with just one man," John chuckled. "You look like a pretty serious guy, and let me tell you, she can't be serious. I could have her back in a second." "You think I'm serious?" Paul said, taking a few steps forward. "You think I give a shit about that girl or what you have to say? I could say goodbye to all this." "What the hell are you even talking about?" John said. The girls laughed, and he soon joined them. Paul didn't answer. He walked away, red-faced and sweaty. He could still hear their laughter unfolding behind him, but he couldn't face it. He grabbed Grace by the arm, and once they were outside, he was able to catch his breath. "What's wrong?" she asked. "That didn't go well at all." He crouched low with his head hanging comically. "What didn't?" "Let's go. Before I change my mind, let's go." A short time later, they pulled into the empty parking lot with the last of the sunlight dwindling beyond the trees. He led her up the nearest path, and when he spotted the crumbling boulder, he indicated that they should leave the trail, but she shook her head. "It's a shortcut," he said, holding out his hand. "There's no one around this late at night, and it's too dark," she argued. "If we get lost, we'll be lost until morning, or worse." Somewhere a coyote howled, and Grace shivered, pulling her blouse closed over her chest. "Well, I'm going. If you don't want to be left here alone, you better follow," Paul said. He started to walk away. "You're a jerk. Why can't we go back to the car and fool around? I'm telling you, this spot is beautiful." "We could be eaten." Paul laughed and took her hand. "Trust me." "Why should I trust you?" "Good point. Maybe you shouldn't. But I'm still going up there and you can follow if you want. Or go back to the car and wait." "You'll get lost." "No, there's a marker right there. See?" He pointed at a wooden stake hammered into the grass. "All we have to do is follow those markers and we'll never get lost." "You've done this a lot, haven't you?" Grace asked. "Of course. But this late at night?" "No. It should be interesting, though." "I'm not going," she insisted, folding her arms. "Suit yourself." Paul broke away from the path and crashed through the brush, taking it one marker at a time. In a matter of seconds, he heard footsteps behind him. Grace caught up with him, breathing hard. "You're really an asshole," she huffed. He hugged her close, and they both set out along the makeshift trail, keeping their eyes to the ground. When it got too dark to see, Paul shook out a keychain flashlight, and they walked even faster. When Grace started to shiver, he gave her his jacket, and when she complained of sore feet, they stopped and he let her sit on his lap. A half an hour later, they were still hiking, and Grace was losing patience. "Come on, let's go back to your place, please," she begged. "It's so close," he told her. "What is?" "My campground." Suddenly, Paul whooped with glee and disappeared into the grouping of trees. Grace chased after him and found she was now standing in a clearing. There were fallen trees all around her, along with a graveyard of dry stumps. Paul took a seat on one of the stumps and craned his neck to stare up at the crooked moon. The stars were plentiful, and even Grace had to admit to their stunning beauty. "How did all these trees fall over?" she asked him. "I'm pretty sure this is a logging site." "Why would they leave the trees behind? Shouldn't they take it all with them, to make paper and stuff?" Grace sat on a neighboring stump, staring longingly up at space. I don't know. Paul got up to kneel between Grace's legs. He started to kiss her hands, tasting her salty skin with his tongue. Paul tried to initiate sex, but she wasn't having any of it. She was too busy staring up at the moon. He gave up and rested his head in her lap. She petted his hair gently. Can I ask you something? He asked her. Yeah? What did you ever see in John Krasner? I don't know. He was kind. He paid attention to me. You know he just wanted to fuck you, right? And I wanted to fuck him. I wanted to fuck you. Paul looked up into her face. How could you want to be with a guy like him? He's terrible. All he does is ever take advantage and tour around like a... What is it with you? She said. In the bar tonight you went right up to John. I saw you. I don't understand why you're so obsessed with him. I'm not obsessed with him. I just hate his guts. You said you didn't even know him. How could you hate someone you don't even know? It's easy, Paul snapped. I can't believe you. She withdrew from the stump and proceeded toward the end of the clearing. Sure, John only had one thing on his mind when he talked to me. But so did you. I saw the way you looked me up and down. That's not all I wanted, Paul retorted. That's true. You wanted to rub me in John's face. You only brought me into that bar tonight to make him jealous. But he wasn't, was he? No, John is never lonely. Paul didn't know what to say. He could only sit there in the grass looking at her stupidly. Grace sighed and sat on a different stump, this time with her back to him. Something inside Paul lifted. He had brought her to the clearing for a reason, other than sex. She stood up and swayed with the cool wind. As he approached her, everything was in slow motion. The trees, the shrubs, and the stars all seemed to smear together. The only thing in focus was Grace's curling hair. His smile was now a wild grimace, and he held meaty hands over his head, as if to catch the wind. Laughter echoed inside Paul's mind, and it wasn't his own. Paul bent down behind Grace and reached for her neck. Inside his mind he was screaming, bathing in gushes of warm blood. I wanted more than you may think, Paul whispered. He placed his hands on her shoulders and squeezed. In his head, he was tearing flesh from bone and howling like a wolf. Paul winced and tightened his fingers around the sides of her neck. He closed his eyes and could see Grace lying dead and heavy in the grass, her tongue hanging out of her open mouth. He saw the red handprints alive on her throat. Cold fingers touched his hands and his grip loosened. Grace turned around and kissed Paul on the forehead. I know you did, she said. I'm sorry. You're a good guy, Paul. You're just so angry. You need to learn how to deal with your aggression. It could kill you if you're not careful. His hands fell away from her, and he leaned into her chest. Are you ready to leave? He asked her. Yep. He looked up from her arms, and the tree was there, standing taller than before and crawling with shadow. He remembered how the axe had come apart in his hands and how the chainsaw had overheated. The tree appeared to wave at him, to welcome him back. It had been waiting. The last time he had seen it, the branches had been naked and gnarled, but now they were ordained with healthy buds. It was doing so much better than he was. While he was wasting away in his room, tossing and turning in bed, the tree was thriving alone. Even after all its neighbors had died out, the tree was still fine, if not better. Let's go, Grace said. She led him back to the first stake, her hand in his. For the second time in a row, Paul left the campground, a failure.